My name is Jamie Hannaford, and I lead the Hydrological Status and Outlooks group at the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology in Wallingford. And today, in this video blog, I'm going to be talking about the current hydrological situation and putting that in a long-term context and talking about what might happen next. Today, I'm mostly going to be talking about a blog post that we've recently published looking at the current water situation, and I'll be referring to that and selecting a few images along the way to explain the various interesting statistics and that I'll be talking about. So the background to this is that here at CEH we host the UK National Hydrological Monitoring Programme, where in collaboration with the British Geological Survey and the Met Office we produce monthly hydrological summaries where we look at the status of UK weather, rivers, reservoirs, groundwater, and so on. We produce these monthly summaries where we look at the current situation, we put it in context, and these are normally released every month. What we've done with this blog post is we've taken some of the material that will come out in the hydrological summary that comes out next week, but because there is interest in the current very dry weather we've had this summer, we've done this blog post a bit early, and we've also pulled in material from a range of other things we do at CEH, including our hydrological outlook, which provides forecasts, and a whole host of other monitoring tools. So just to set the scene, that's what the National Hydrological Monitoring Programme is. And the reason why we've done this blog post is reflecting on the summer that we're having in 2018. As I'm sure everyone is aware, we've had an excellent summer in terms of weather. From the point of view of holiday making or tourism, certainly we've had lots of dry weather, lots of sunshine, and it's been very warm. Obviously, those heatwave conditions, as beneficial they are for some things, have also caused very significant impacts on people and the environment. And these persistent hot and dry conditions have led to concerns over water supplies. So in this blog post, we're looking at the weather and the hydrological situation and trying to explain how severe things are and what might happen next. And the first question we ask in this blog post is, what is the current situation and is it exceptional? Well, certainly July was an exceptional month. We had very hot temperatures and very little rainfall, really, anywhere in the country. Most places have little rainfall until the end of the month. Here at our meteorological station we have in CEH in Wallingford, which I can see out of my window actually, we had no rain days, so that's days with more than 1 millimetre of rainfall, between the 1st of June and the 20th of July. So that's a spell of 48 days with no appreciable rainfall. And that in fact equals the record for our site, which was established in 1997. So that's 48 days, 48 dry days at this site. And that's in a record that's been observed daily since 1962. So this was quite exceptional in terms of that spell of having no rainfall at all. And this was seen over many other parts of the country as well, a really extended period with just no rain. And then I'm going to sort of broaden out a bit really. That's just looking quite parochially at our own weather station. But now what we do through the Hydrological Monitoring Programme is look at things on a UK scale and regionally. So how was July at the national scale? Well, in fact, because there was very intense rainfall in the closing days of July, which in fact caused some flash flooding in some places, as in Northern Ireland, the July rainfall was not as exceptional as in June. For the UK as a whole, we had 73% of the average for July. Some parts of the Midlands and the South East saw actually less than half the typical rainfall for July, whereas in Northern Ireland and bits of Western Scotland, they actually had near average rainfall. So July was not as exceptional as the previous month. But when we look at the June and July, and really going back to May, if we look at that whole period together, we see that for the last 3 months, we've experienced a really significant meteorological drought at the UK scale. For the UK as a whole, it was the third driest May to July period in a record, the Met Office record going back to 1910. So that's actually significant. It's a very long record, and only 2 other May to July periods, which incidentally were 1984 and 1989, only 2 other periods have been drier for the May to July timeframe. Some other regions as well, in some other regions, it was actually the second driest. So in Anglian, it was the second driest after 1921, and in the Northwest after 1984. And those are quite notable drought years in those regions. So that really gives some context that we have had a a really quite significant meteorological drought over the last 3 months. Another way you can look at that, this is the sort of information we put out in our hydrological summaries where we publish various statistics, but you can also look interactively at the dryness of the last 3 months. I'm showing on the screen here a screenshot from the UK Drought Portal. And this, interestingly, was a piece of work. This came out of a number of projects, including some of the projects funded through the Drought and Water Scarcity Programme. And this is a piece of software that allows users to explore rainfall data, including the current month's rainfall data, and actually interactively look at how severe that was through a nice interface that allows you to map up the rainfall and look at the historical time series. And I'm not going to go into detail because the great thing about this is it's a tool you can go onto and explore for your local area. But the key story there is that across the UK as a whole, then using this drought indicator, the standardized precipitation index, it was exceptional over the 3-month period over much of the UK. Many areas showing extremely dry up here in the northwest and down here in Anglia. But I won't say too much more about that other than that you can obviously explore those data yourselves. I should say as well, I've been talking there about May, June, July because we only have the data up to the end of July for the hydrological summary that we're about to publish. But obviously we're now on the 9th of August, so we've gone into August, and certainly in early August the dryness and heatwave conditions have continued in much of England and Wales. The weather's changed a little in the last few days, but we did have very arid conditions extending into early August, despite the very wet into July. So that's to give some context for the rainfall. And I'd now like to talk in turn about soil moisture, river flows, groundwater and reservoirs. So from a soil moisture point of view, this very low rainfall and the high evaporation associated with the heatwave conditions has caused soils to dry out. And I'm sure that will be obvious to everyone from the state of gardens or allotments or parks. So the soils have dried out and that's causing stress to vegetation and crops. And I'm sure, again, the brown grass that will be familiar to everyone really as a result of this very dry and hot period. We can look at this more scientifically through a number of tools. The Cosmos UK network allows you to explore soil moisture data in near real time. And I'm going to show an example here of looking at the live data feed. There's a mapping interface and you can then go in and choose one of the 50 sites from around the country and actually explore some soil moisture data. So let's pick a site here in Surrey, and if you look at the time series data and you look over the last 3 months, you should be able to see it on screen. Now we can see this graph up here is showing the soil moisture content over the last 3 months, and you can see how it drops off really significantly through June and July. There's a little blip at the end with some rainfall at the end of the month, but generally that decline in soil moisture is very obvious over the last couple of months. Okay, so that's Cosmos UK that you can explore very interactively. I'm now going to return to discussing this blog. The thing about the Cosmos UK data is the stations have only been in place really since 2013 and beyond. We can get a longer term view from another soil moisture product, so a modelling product from the Met Office called Morex that we feature in our hydrological summary. This goes back to 1961. And if we look at the Morex data, we can see that at the end of July, soil moisture was notably low around the country, comparable with many drought episodes in the past. Northwest England, in fact, had the lowest soil moisture on record for that region in that time series from 1961. Okay, so I'm now going to move on from soil moisture onto river flows. July was exceptional in terms of river flows with some very low flows. Many responsive rivers, so the flashier rivers that respond quickly to rainfall, they receded towards near record flows late in July, but many increased sharply late in the month where there was a pulse of a very heavy rainfall. Despite that, the July average flows were notably or exceptionally low across northern and western Britain. And if you look on this map in the blog, you can see that there's on the left-hand side, there is a map for July, and all of these orange circles showing exceptionally low flows in many parts of the north and west. Some of these have circles around a couple of sites. Those mean that they are the lowest July average flows on record. I draw attention to one particularly here up in Scotland, the River Dee in northern Scotland. That has a record going back to 1929. Most rivers in the UK, the records really only go back to the 1960s, so this goes back to the 20s. And so this shows that the July we've just experienced in terms of river flows was very exceptional for this catchment indeed. If we average the river flow over the last 2 months, so that's June and July, and we can see record low flows for many catchments, again in the north and west. So as well as the two I just mentioned, you can see the Lune and the Ribble in northwest England, and a few others were the lowest on record for June and July as a whole. Now moving on to groundwater. I think the thing to say about groundwater in this case is that there's, as you can see, little text here because the groundwater levels were generally in the normal range in southeast England. And I'll come on to this in a moment where I talk more about comparing this event to past droughts. But so far, groundwater levels are normal. And that's despite this really dry period we've had in the last few months. And that really reflects the fact that we had a very wet spring in much of southern and eastern England where the main aquifers are. And so groundwater has carried on really, has been sustained through the summer and is normal in most cases. And most groundwater fed rivers are also in the normal range. Okay, I'm also going to move on to reservoirs now. As you might expect, given the dry weather and the high evaporation, reservoir stocks were below average across the north and west of the UK. Many reservoirs were less than 10% below average for late July, and some reservoirs were actually more than 20% below average. So in some impoundments up in the northwest of England, across Wales and in the southern Pennines, they were notably below average. So, for example, the Derwent Valley Reservoir Group, there's a picture here taken by one of our team, Katie Mutchen, who took this photo on the 28th of July, looking at the Derwent Valley system. For that reservoir group, it was the third lowest reservoir stocks for late July in a record from 1988. So only 1990 and 96 saw lower reservoir levels in that reservoir system. If we look at England and Wales as a whole, so if we look at the reservoir stocks averaged across the country, then the situation at the end of July, the stocks were only 1% above what they were in 1995, which is known to be an exceptional drought year. Okay, so that's given a flavour of the situation in rivers, rainfall and so on. We also mentioned some comments around the impacts in this blog. Certainly the aridity we've seen in the last couple of months, both rainfall and high temperatures, has unsurprisingly led to concerns about water resources. The welcome rainfall in the north and west at the end of July has certainly improved the outlook in the short term from a water supply point of view. There was a hosepipe ban in place in Northern Ireland in June, which was actually lifted in July. The ban was less to do with the water resources availability and more to do with the very high demand and the infrastructural challenges of providing water when temperatures were so high and demand was so high. There was a hosepipe ban planned for northwest England for the United Utilities Water Resources Water Company, sorry. That was set to begin on the 5th of August, but in fact that wasn't enacted following the rainfall that we saw at the end of July. Other impacts though, several sections of canal in northern England were closed in early August due to the low levels in the feeder canals for those systems. So the Canal and Rivers Trust closed some of those sites, which is obviously a fairly important impact of the dry weather. And also looking beyond water resources, certainly the soil moisture conditions I mentioned earlier have led to a really serious agricultural drought across much of the UK, severely affecting farmers and growers all around the country. There are some links in the blog post to some news stories discussing some of these impacts on the agricultural community. The dry soils as well have led to more severe wildfires. There's been lots of coverage of this in the news. Many wildfires especially in some of the upland areas of the country. And also other environmental impacts have been widely reported. So algal blooms have been reported in many areas as a result of the low river flows and very high temperatures. And there's also been other ecological stress on aquatic ecology. So fish rescues have been widely reported, as well as other impacts on ecosystems. Okay, so hopefully that's given an idea of what the current situation is and also how severe that is by looking at some historical records. In the rest of the blog post, we then go on to talk about how 2018 compares to some past drought years. First of all, the first thing to say is that the very hot, dry summer conditions have inevitably led to comparisons with 1976. And that's not surprising at all, because that is very widely remembered by everyone and the media as a really major drought event in the UK. And in fact, it's been widely acknowledged that is really the benchmark drought. You know, it's certainly the drought that many people do use in considering the how severe droughts can be. So it's the benchmark drought for much of southern Britain, at least in terms of our recent our river flow records going back to the 60s. And meteorologically, I think it's important to say that there's a good basis for comparison between 1976 and 2018, both exceptional heatwave summers, and as I said earlier on, for the May to July period for the UK as a whole, the 2018 rainfall was actually lower than it was for the equivalent time in 1976. So certainly in the summer we've seen so far, it's actually been drier nationally across the UK than it was in 1976. However, the important thing is that 1976 was much more severe over longer time frames. So if you include the previous spring and the previous winter, then 1976 was much more severe. If you look over longer periods, longer than the May to July period I've talked about so far, then the rainfall deficits we've seen in 2018 and going back into 2017, although they're interesting, they normally rank well outside of the sort of top rainfall deficits, and they're not comparable with the notable drought episodes that we've seen nationally in the UK and regionally. So although what we've seen over the last couple of months shows that we're dealing with a really significant meteorological drought, so far at least it's been relatively short-lived in the areas where it's had a big impact. So that really sets the scene in terms of the weather and the rainfall deficits, and that has also had big impacts on, it's resulted in important differences to 1976 in hydrological terms. 2018 in many ways has the hallmarks of what we might call a summer drought, which is arguably actually more comparable to 1984 or 1995. The low river flows we've seen have mostly been observed in the north and west, where there is limited groundwater supplies and rivers and reservoirs tend to decline rapidly in response to sustained hot, dry conditions in the summer. And this is a key difference with 1976. In 2018, the spring was actually very wet in southern and eastern England. So, as I said earlier, the wet spring, which actually was quite a late pulse of groundwater recharge, because the preceding winter had been, the early winter was quite dry, but the wet spring in the southeast of England has sustained flows, river flows, in groundwater-fed rivers. That's what we've seen this year, whereas in 1976 it was very different. That arid summer of 76 followed a really dry spring and winter in the southeast. And in that area of the English lowlands down in the southeast, reduced winter half-year recharge, so that means winter half-year we mean normally October to March. If we get reduced groundwater recharge in that period, that's normally a key driver of some of the major droughts. Many of the most severe droughts in that region have arisen from a combination of dry winters, so successive dry winters as in 2004 to 6, 1990 to 92, more recently 2010 to 12. These are all associated with dry winter conditions in the southeast of England, sometimes in combination with heatwave summers too, so 1976 itself, 1990, 2006. these heatwave years followed on from dry winters in the southeast, and that's what caused impacts, particularly on groundwater and groundwater-fed rivers. Whereas in 2018, we haven't seen that as a result of that very wet spring we had in the southeast. And there's a nice story in this blog post to show in one graph quite neatly how this year in 2018 in some ways is very much like 1976, but in other ways it's really quite different. These graphs show the river flows for two contrasting rivers. So the top one here is in South Wales, Southwest Wales. And this is a very responsive, flashy catchment in South Wales. And the bottom one here shows a permeable catchment, a groundwater-fed catchment on the Chalk in Berkshire. And they also show some lines showing other notable drought years. Effectively, they look at the lowest river flows for July, and they find the 5 other years with the lowest flows in July. And as you can see from the top graph in this site in Wales, the current month in black, that is certainly very, very notable for the recent month, and it's down at levels that are comparable with 1976, 1984, and other major drought years. So in the West, at least, what we've seen in terms of river flows is comparable with 76 and some other major droughts. Down in the southeast of England, it's a rather different story. The Lambourne at Shore, this chalk catchment, you can see that the 2018 river flows are much higher than all of the major drought years that we've highlighted on this plot. 76 is the lowest for this site, and there's some other major drought years like 1997 and 2006. So in the chalk catchments of the south and east at least, this increase in river flows in March and April and May has sustained the flows through this dry summer. So that shows you how in some ways there are parallels with 1976, but really important differences in terms of the expression spatially of this drought so far. I should say, of course, that these comparisons are based on the stories so far, and the character of the current situation could change dramatically. The 1976 drought really, which had the biggest impacts in the summer, that ended dramatically in autumn with an extremely wet autumn, which recovered the situation quite rapidly. The 1984 drought as well, that was a notable summer event, a within-year event that didn't really continue beyond that summer. In contrast, I've mentioned 1995, and that was a really notable arid summer drought, but it actually marked the start of a long period of reduced rainfall. It eventually led to further impacts in 1996 in northern England, and eventually, as a result of dry winter and spring conditions, a groundwater drought in southern England in 1997. So that's just to say that the comparisons we've made are based on where we are now, and obviously things can change over the coming months. So I'd now like to move on to the question, what will happen next? And this is an enormously challenging question to answer. But one of the things that we are doing is looking at producing forecasts very, very actively. Operationally, we at CEH, along with the British Geological Survey, the Met Office, and partners in the Environment Agency, SEPA, NRW, and the Department for Infrastructure in Northern Ireland, we all collaborate on producing an operational hydrological outlook. And what this is essentially a seasonal forecasting tool to forecast river flows and groundwater over the next month to 3 months. The latest hydrological outlook here that I'm referring to suggests that below normal river flows will persist through August in the north and west, with notably low flows likely to continue in some places. And you can see this is summarised on this map here. There's a distinction between the north and west, where river flows are likely to be below normal and possibly notably low in August. The outlook for the next 3 months suggests that river flows in northern and western areas, some of those will return towards the normal range, although down in the southwest of England there's a signal towards low flows persisting. And in the southeast, the outlook is more variable, with geology being a really crucial influence on the outlook. As I discussed previously, in groundwater-fed catchments, river flows are likely to be normal over the next 3 months, whilst in the more responsive surface water-fed rivers, we may see normal flows over the next 3 months. That's the sort of They're the key messages coming out of the Outlook. And you can click on, you can go through to the Hydrological Outlook and find not just this summary map and headlines, but also lots of very detailed information on all of the modelling that supports this. There's a 12-page document that describes all of the hydrological modelling outputs that allow us to project what's going to happen over the next 1 to 3 months. So what we can say, if the projections favouring the lower flows come to pass, then we will certainly see continuing environmental stress in the late summer and the autumn, with the prospect of further water restrictions. Certainly there's the prospect of water shortages and restrictions would be raised if we start to see a continuation of the sorts of low flows we have at the moment. And obviously with that, there will be undoubtedly further socioeconomic impacts following on. I should say that there's much uncertainty in these seasonal scale hydrological forecasts. It's a very challenging business forecasting weather and forecasting river flows over a month or more for the UK, which has a very variable climate, influenced very much by the Atlantic. So seasonal weather forecasting is challenging, and hydrological forecasting with it. So there's lots of uncertainty in these projections. But what we can say is that given the currently depleted river flows, it's clear that we do need above average rainfall to replenish river flows and reservoir levels. And if we go through August and it remains dry, then the focus will be going into the autumn and winter, which is when reservoir replenishment normally occurs and groundwater recharge occurs. All eyes will be on what might happen for the coming autumn and winter season. So hopefully that's been of interest in providing an overview of the current situation. Thank you very much for listening today, and goodbye.